There came a moment, long before the first flag was stitched, long before a constitution was signed, long before a cannon echoed across Lexington Green, when God looked upon a vast and untamed continent and said, I will need a people. Not the richest people, not the oldest civilization, not the easiest life. I need a people who will build freedom where none has ever existed before. So God made Americans. God said, I need somebody willing to leave behind everything familiar, cross an ocean in ships too small for the sea, bury loved ones through harsh winters, and still wake the next morning believing tomorrow will be better. So God made Americans. He needed people who understood that liberty was not inherited. It was earned. People willing to exchange comfort for opportunity, security for possibility. A people stubborn enough to believe that ordinary men were capable of governing themselves, not because they were perfect, but because no king ever would be. So God made Americans. God said, I need somebody willing to stand on a village green against the most powerful empire on earth. Somebody who knows the odds are impossible, who hears the drums of the British Army, smells the powder, sees polished bayonets glistening in the morning sun, and still refuses to surrender. Somebody who would sign a declaration knowing it might become his own death warrant. Who would pledge his life, his fortune, his sacred honor, and mean every word. So God made Americans. He needed mothers willing to melt family heirlooms into bullets, fathers willing to leave plows standing in the field, children willing to grow up before their time, pastors who preached liberty, blacksmiths who forged weapons, merchants who sacrificed fortunes, farmers who became soldiers, because freedom required every hand. So God made Americans. God said, I need somebody who can lose battles, endure winters without shoes, survive Valley Forge, bury friends beneath frozen ground, and still march when the spring arrives. Somebody who understands that victory belongs not merely to the strongest, but to those who refuse to quit. So God made Americans. And when the impossible happened, when 13 fragile colonies defeated the greatest military power on earth, God was not finished, because winning independence is easier than keeping it. So God made Americans. He needed people wise enough to argue without becoming enemies, strong enough to restrain their own government, humble enough to admit that power itself needed limits. Men who could disagree passionately, yet sign one Constitution, a document so remarkable that nearly exactly on today's date, 250 years later, the world still studies it and copies it. So God made Americans. God said, I need a nation where your name matters less than your character, where a blacksmith's son may become president, where the daughter of immigrants might become a judge, where a poor child, if willing to work, might one day own the factory instead of merely sweeping its floors, a place where destiny is earned, not assigned. So God made Americans. He needed inventors that would light cities, builders who would span continents, teachers who would educate generations, entrepreneurs who would risk everything on an idea scribbled onto a napkin, workers who would rise before sunrise, and families who believed tomorrow should always belong to their children. So God made Americans. God said, "There will come times when freedom is threatened far beyond these shores. I will need young men willing to leave farms in Iowa, factories in Michigan, fishing boats in Maine, ranches in Texas, classrooms in California, and carry liberty to places they have never seen." So God made Americans. They crossed oceans in 1917. They stormed beaches in 1944. They flew over Europe, fought through the Pacific, held frozen hills in Korea, walked steaming jungles in Vietnam, defended deserts in Kuwait, climbed mountains in Afghanistan, because whenever tyranny believed freedom had grown weak, America answered. Not because war is glorious, but because peace sometimes demands courage. So God made Americans. He needed nurses who healed strangers, pilots who never returned, Gold Star families who bore unimaginable grief with quiet dignity, neighbors who welcomed veterans home, communities that placed little flags besides countless white crosses. Because liberty always carries a cost, paid by remarkably few on behalf of us all. So God made Americans. God said, "I need somebody who opens the gate, somebody who sees not only where a man came from, but where he hopes to go. A nation where millions escaping oppression whisper one word, America. Where broken people arrive carrying little more than hope and have for over 2.5 centuries. And discover that hope is enough to begin again. So God made Americans. He needed a people who would feed the hungry after disasters, rebuild cities after hurricanes, land on the moon simply because it was difficult, map the human genome, create medicines, invent industries, write symphonies, build businesses, explore frontiers, not because success was guaranteed, but because failure was never final. So God made Americans. God said, "These people will not always get everything right. They will argue. They will stumble. They will disappoint one another. They will sometimes forget just how extraordinary their inheritance truly is. But if they remember who they are, they will remain a light." So God made Americans. Because America was never merely an economy, never merely an army, never merely a flag. America has always been an idea. The radical idea that God grants rights, not governments, that liberty belongs to every soul, that opportunity is worth sacrifice, that tomorrow need not resemble yesterday, and that ordinary people, blessed by providence and guided by principle, can accomplish extraordinary things. So God made Americans. And now, exactly 250 years have passed. The greatest danger no longer sails towards our shores beneath a foreign flag. It whispers from within. Division over unity, comfort over sacrifice, entitlement over gratitude. The question before us is no longer whether another empire can defeat America. History has answered that. The only question remaining is whether Americans will forget what made America. Will we still raise children who understand duty? Will we still honor courage over convenience? Will we still defend free speech, free enterprise, free worship, and the simple belief that every person deserves the chance to pursue happiness? Will we still leave this republic stronger than we found it? Because every generation inherits the same responsibility. Freedom is never finally won. It is only temporarily entrusted. God did not promise America perpetual greatness. He entrusted greatness to Americans. And every sunrise asks the same question. What will you do with it today? if we remember the courage of those who crossed oceans, the resolve of those who stood at Lexington, the endurance of those at Valley Forge, the sacrifice of those at Normandy, the determination of those who built railroads, factories, schools, churches, businesses, and families, then the next 250 years may yet become our finest. Because if we surrender not to foreign armies, but to our own division, our own complacency, our own forgetting, then no enemy need conquer us, for we will have conquered ourselves. And somewhere, just beyond the noise of politics, beyond headlines, beyond arguments, one can almost hear the quiet voice that has guided this nation since its beginning. I gave you liberty. I gave you opportunity. I gave you one another. Now, be worthy of the gift, because on that day, God looked upon a new world that desperately needed freedom, and so God made Americans. Happy 250th birthday, America. Build that stack. iBankerU. Good day.